I spoke to Thomas Piketty earlier today. Of course, it was a stressful start. He missed his plane and didn't arrive yesterday. He's now in the country that he spoke about in his book. In the beginning, he mentions Marikana, the tragedy that unfolded, and I asked him what it's like to be in a country that unfortunately is an expert in inequality.
Well, I'm so eager, to learn more about South Africa, learn more about the country. To me and to many people around the world from my generation, South Africa, of course, has a universal meaning. I was born in 1971, so I turned 18 in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, but also when Nelson Mandela was finally liberated from jail. And when I was a teenager, this is something which was impossible to believe from France. The fact that apartheid was still there, and the fact that South Africa has been able to get away from there in a very sort of peaceful and democratic manner is so impressive from viewed from the rest of the world. And of course, I don't underestimate all the difficulties and the very high inequality level that we still see in South Africa, and that I could see this morning walking through neighborhoods and to Alexandra. But that's to me, it's really an honor to be there, to be the opportunity to learn more and to better understand where the country is going.
Apartheid was engineered inequality. We're now sitting at the Nelson Mandela Center. Nelson Mandela came in, the ANC came in, they had choices. Some people have said that, in fact, there should have been a more radical effort to redistribute wealth. Mandela moved from nationalisation to privatisation. We brought down trade barriers. Foreign companies that came in no longer had these conditions attached, which would have been a form of a tax. Have you had a chance to look at South Africa's policy choices?
I am here to learn, not to give lessons, but I think that indeed there is more scope for redistribution of wealth than there has been so far. It's already, of course, an incredible achievement to achieve equality of formal rights and the state of law, and with a democratic transition, this was an achievement. But it is true that there was never in South Africa the kind of land reform or the kind of direct redistribution of property that we see throughout history in many countries, many continents, in Europe, in Asia. You see land reform so as to allow people who don't have land to access property, and in order to reduce also the extreme concentration of property at the top end, which we see at different points in history in different contexts, but which of course in the context of the apartheid system took a particularly extreme form. So it's a bit sad in a way to see that today in South Africa, 20 years after the end of apartheid and the first free elections, the share of national income going to the top 10% of the population is above 60%, which is, much higher than in Europe, where it would be 30 to 40%, higher than in the US, where it would be 50%, higher than in Brazil, where it would be 55 to 60%, well, higher than pretty much every country that I have studied and for which I have seen data. So the data we have is not perfect, but from what we have, we can say that inequality is probably more extreme in South Africa, even 20 years after the end of apartheid, than we've ever been able to measure inequality in history. And part of the reason, I think, is that if you need some form of direct redistribution of land, of property, and probably also more transparency about property. So it's very difficult in South Africa, my experience with working in different countries, to access the inheritance tax and estate tax data. There's no annual tax on wealth, so there's no data. And I think introducing an annual wealth tax, even with very low tax rate, just to record the wealth and to see who owns what and how the different wealth groups are benefiting from growth and development over time, is important for democracy and for the democratic debate, so that we can adapt our policies, our tax policies and regulation to whatever we observe.
It's interesting you mention estate duty. We have a tax committee now looking at various things. They've rejected a wealth tax, but looking at estate duty tax. South Africa also has this huge social spend, infrastructure, many grants for the poor, and we're currently looking at minimum wages. Any thoughts on that?
I think South Africa should and hopefully will introduce a minimum wage. I think every country needs some form of minimum wage legislation, not only in developed countries in Europe or the US, where we've had national minimum wages for a very long time, but also if you look in Brazil, the rise of the minimum wage in the past 15 years, in particular under Lula, was one of the powerful force for reducing poverty, reducing inequality, and in the end it did not cost jobs. So of course, it's a matter of degree, and setting the right level for the national minimum wage is complicated. But in any case, I think this is something that's absolutely necessary.
Finally, you focus on the US, UK, and France. Are your findings relevant for emerging markets like South Africa? Some people say because of poor education, any efforts that we're doing to redistribute wealth are being scuppered right now.
Well, I study the experience of many different countries from an historical perspective. So I think there are lessons you can learn from the development trajectory of Europe or North America in the 19th century, 18th century, 20th century, which can be useful for South Africa, for Brazil today. I think we also have a lot to learn from South Africa. I think the common conclusion for all this experience is that we need more transparency about income and wealth dynamics. You know, it's very difficult in a society where you don't have access to the most basic estate tax data, so that you cannot really measure how the concentration of wealth is changing and who benefits from the BEE policy or who does not benefit, what has been the impact on the distribution of wealth. If we don't have this kind of democratic transparency, then this opens the way for claims which can be very extreme in one way or another, but it's very difficult to have a peaceful democratic conversation.